Okay, yeah. So you probably know, like, but there's an American chapter called the American Solar Society.
Yeah.
And they would obviously be a body to like those. Where do you mostly help?
So we're mostly working in SIDS right now. SID has small island development states. So a lot of the kind of small countries have a big potential to reach 100%. And China, for example, Jamaica has all these great projects. So it really shows just how leadership so we're working more not just in the US internationally. Really, what we want to do is try and increase the visibility. A big part of what we're doing with all the media partnerships. We get kicked out.
Slowly.
Online? You know, media partnerships.
Should be Adaptation, NDCs,
So, what you would think was just a secure
Yeah.
Hi, hello. Nice to meet you. Brian. Yes, exactly.
Sure. Yeah, great. Yeah, great.
Why is there? No, yeah. So I lived in North Carolina before this. Yeah. You're basically oh, really? So there you go. That makes sense now. But that's
Sorry, thanks very much.
Yeah, I know it's unfortunate, but yeah, I enjoy it.
For your information, there's also traditional
Okay, so if I want the questions by my
well, Q&A. We also have the catch box. Are you familiar with this?
no.
It's basically it's a microphone that you can throw.
Are you serious?
So you can try your rugby skills, throw it to the other side of the room. It's silent when it's in the front,
Uh-huh.
and when it arrives, then it's live.
So I think they'll enjoy this.
Yeah, it's a good motivator,
Fantastic.
especially at 8 o'clock at night.
Yeah, no, we're gonna line ourselves up a bit.
And you should just shut up yourself.
So
So it's going to squeeze up there.
Okay, agreed.
Yes, I am.
Understandable, we have a lot of potential. He's got some thoughts. Did you know? Yeah, he's very smart.
Dankeschön, die habe ich noch gebraucht.
She's in the middle of it. She moves. I wasn't able to solve that one. So you can walk around. See fancies too.
Start? Oh, Birgit
Just
is
got
there.
Birgit.
Yeah.
Wants to come in a
Sitting
second.
outside.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Well, thank you to our audience. We understand it was a busy week. This is a Friday evening, and despite all the stresses of a long conference week and the tiredness you all must feel, we very much appreciate your coming to this side event. It's the second in a series of 3 side events. You might have seen our wonderful little flyers in the cafeteria and elsewhere, where the Rome-based agencies, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, for the World Food Programme, and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization are jointly organizing. We've seen a lot of momentum around agriculture in this specific session this week. We have 2 themes, one on adaptation, one on mitigation, in which agriculture is playing a prominent role. We just closed one. And with this event series, we actually want to look a little bit deeper into the issues connected with agriculture. We had our first meeting on Tuesday, on the second day, looking into loss and damages and how to build resilience. And in this meeting today, we want to focus on adaptation planning, on NAPs, and the relationship between NDCs and NAPs. We know, of course, that the Paris Agreement is built on the basis of the NDCs, but the NDCs are not the first time that the countries plan for climate change mitigation and adaptation. We know that out of Cancun 2010, the NAPs were born to guide countries' work on adaptation planning. And the challenge is now how to align this adaptation planning in the broader context of the NDCs and the realization of the Paris Agreement. Let me say that this side event today is organized by IFAD, and IFAD started already in 2012, the ASAP initiative. ASAP stands for Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program. And under ASAP, the issue is that to bring finance in order that smallholder can access technology and knowledge to build up their resilience for climate change. It is now the biggest single financing source worldwide for adaptation of smallholders. So we are very happy to work with you on this program. From our side, and I didn't introduce myself, Martin Frick, I'm the head of the climate change division at UNFCCC. From our side, we've been supporting the LEG group that already in 2012 invited that their guidelines on NAPS planning might be supplemented for specific areas. And we have a brand new product here, which is still warm off the press, which is the supplementary guidelines to address agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in national adaptation plans. If you want to have this study, we have very few copies of it, since this is a paperless organization, or mostly paperless, but we have it downloadable on our website, and that gives detailed guidance for policymakers for adaptation planning. But now, without further ado, I would like to introduce a fantastic panel, and also my many thanks to the panel of being with us on a Friday evening, knowing that we are basically the only thing between you and hopefully a bit of a relaxing weekend. Let me start to my left, Bruce Campbell, Program Director of CCAFs. Bruce is a known figure to many of us. We've been now on several panels over this week. Bruce will talk about innovation and research in the context of national adaptation planning. Next, we have Birgit Gerhardus, Head of Division for Rural Development, Land Rights and Forests in the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. And we are curious to hear what adaptation planning for agriculture, what role that is playing in the German Development Corporation. Then next we have Dustin Shin is a climate change specialist from the Global Environmental Fund Secretariat, and the Jeff has been supporting NAPAs, and we understand is also supporting NAPs, and we are interested to hear more about that from you. Then next on is Dr. Ram Prasad Lamsal, Joint Secretary in the Climate Change Management Division of the Ministry of Population and Environment from Nepal. And we are certainly eager to learn how that looks from a country perspective. How do you do your adaptation planning? And all the way to the left, to your right, scene is Justin Hofmeister, International Climate Policy Specialist at the Green Climate Fund. And you might know that after the last COP, the Green Climate Fund announced a specific funding line in the readiness perspective of the Green Climate Fund for adaptation planning. So having introduced the panel, I would go straight into the first question. Allow me to start with the country representative, and maybe to kick off, Dr. Lamsal, we could ask you for your experiences in Nepal, the planning process, the challenges, and your experiences in integrating the agricultural sectors in the adaptation planning. Dr. Lamsal, you have the floor.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for organizer for your invitation. I would like to start with Nepal from climate change perspective, then climate change policy, then NAP and NDC interrelationship. So Nepal is one of the climate vulnerable country. So we do have a population of 0.39%, and we do contribute only 0.027% of global greenhouse gas emission. So over the period of 31 years, the temperature increase has been found 1.8 degrees Celsius, that is average 0.04 degrees Celsius per year. Of course, it depends on methodology also, its reliability also. So in order to address the issue of climate change, we do have a climate change policy. We do have a NAPA document. We do have, besides NAPA, we have also LAPA, local level adaptation plan of action, where communities are being engaged with the local level development planning process, coordinating with climate change planning. So again, we do have also, government has introduced climate change budget code in the planning process, so that the track how much resources being channelized to the climate change. Besides the perspective of Ministry of Environment, then local development ministry, they have introduced environment friendly local governance framework in order to also address environment and climate change. Besides this one, then forestry sector has developed a RED Plus strategy, and then we are in process of developing national adaptation plan, for which Green Climate Fund has agreed to provide support of $2.9 million. Then I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the friend left to me. So under the NAP process, I think we from Ministry of Population and Environment, we are developing a national perspective of the NAP that is aligning with UNFCCC process. Besides our NAPs, then there are two sector ministries. They are also developing their sector NAPs. That is, one is Ministry of Health, the second one is Ministry of Agriculture Development. So we have to harmonize these two sectoral planning document and our national adaptation plan formulation process. Here I want to highlight issue. The NAP, National Adaptation Plan, has been prepared with the intention to make it to be implementable. Of course, it will be legally non-binding. There are other development ministries who they do have a legal and institutional instrument that are so strict, so powerful. So again, to make the country to move in low carbon development path, then certainly we from Ministry of Environment will need both legal tool as well as institutional tool in order to pursue the low carbon development path. So, and we are also in process of developing low carbon development strategy, and that will be aligned with sustainable development goals that is the country has agreed, and that Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. These are the policy document that we are trying. And under National Adaptation Plan, there are two dimensions. One is process, the second one is content. A group of experts, they can write National Adaptation Plan in a certain month, maybe, but that is not much important rather than the country-driven and stakeholder-led process. So each and every ministries, 9 sectoral groups are formed in which each ministries, they are leading the themes. So hopefully we will able to prepare and start to implement NAP in 1.5 in 18 months period from now. So regarding the mostly adaptation focused in NDC, it is said that NDC is adaptation focused, but in our case, we have clearly sent our signal and commitment that climate action in our case is both adaptation and mitigation is critically to its development objective, and that we have submitted our NDC. Under mitigation target, we have committed to follow the low carbon development path. We have not quantified the emission target. So that is the part. And actually the adaptation in our case is linked with sustainable development and socio-economic development that from which we can create a strong, healthy and resilient society. So again, emission reduction basically in our cases is related with agriculture and energy, infrastructure and land use sector, in which the energy sector that is contribute a lot, that is 28% of the greenhouse emission. Looking the perspective of the global perspective, that amount is not much. But from our perspective, certainly based on our capacity and our scope and our limitation, adaptation is our priority. That is, we want to also, we cannot avoid, or we cannot neglect the mitigation part. We want to implement our nationally determined contribution. So particularly the community-based resource management, it is not forest management. In community-based resource management cases, actually the country like ours, it is hard to differentiate adaptation and mitigation again. For example, I will give the perspective of alternative energy. Is it mitigation and it is adaptation? It is both. In our case, it is hard to differentiate. Looking like climate smart agriculture, it is, for example, in our case, agriculture is contributing 71% of the green gas emission, rest is 1%. So if agriculture, climate smart agriculture intervention, it is contributing adaptation and mitigation, it is both. It is hard to differentiate in real life when community are actively engaged. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it resonates with an ongoing set of conversation we have been having this week. Some of them I had the pleasure to moderate, that the design of UNFCCC of this process was clearly not with agriculture intended, and the separation that we have from the process in mitigation and adaptation very often is not working. And thank you for putting the pieces together of the Sendai framework, the adaptation, the mitigation piece, and certainly the socioeconomic development and the fulfillment of the SDGs. So my question in that is to Bruce. Bruce, is it just putting together the pieces that are around, or is there innovation, and what kind of research and innovation can actually support these multiple aims that we are pursuing at the same time?
Okay. So first of all, I should say that I see innovation in a rather broad sense. And I think I've got about 5 short points on the role of innovation in seeing action on the ground in terms of agriculture in the NAPs and INDCs. So the first one is that there's multiple objectives in agriculture. Incomes for farmers, national exchequer and trade issues, adaptation to a future which we don't actually know so well because the climate models are not that great, adaptation to the current in terms of climate risks and extreme events, and doing it in a sustainable manner. How do we get that all right, those multiple objectives? So it's the synergies and trade-offs amongst these multiple objectives, I think, is a ripe area for research and development. The second point is that if you look at the NDCs, they're at a really high level. And I think there's a big role for innovation and understanding, downscaling them to practical action on the ground, and made realistic as well. Why do I say made realistic? I give the example that I've used elsewhere, fertilizer use, inorganic fertilizer use. A country suggests that they're going to cut down their fertilizer use when their national average is 12 kgs per hectare, which is minuscule. It's nothing. It's not going to do any good to the world in terms of cutting down the fertilizer use, and it's not going to do the agricultural sector any good by cutting down that. So understanding those kinds of issues and downscaling the NDCs. The third one is context-specific solutions, and we've heard this in other agricultural sectors, where a farm over here is very different from a farm just 500 meters away. And the example I've used before is alternate wetting and drying in rice. It's a great technology, can just but very simple changes, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% and maintain the yields. But if you do it in the uplands versus the highlands, if you do it in the summer growing season as opposed to the other season, and if you do it on rich soils as opposed to organic soils, it makes a big difference to the greenhouse gas emissions. And in some circumstances, it's not worth implementing alternate wetting and drying. And in some circumstances, on the rich organic soils, you'll increase the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a huge role for science to understand where to do things, and with what kind of farmers, rich farmers, poor farmers, vulnerable farmers, etc. The fourth one is focusing on adaptive capacity. So I see innovation as not dumping technologies on farmers and expecting them to take things up, or is rather providing farmers with the information and the assets that they can make the choice about what to do best, and providing them the enabling environment, the policies, the incentives to do things. So building adaptive capacity means local innovation with service providers and with farmers themselves. And the last point, and it goes back to seeing innovation not as the traditional research done in a laboratory and then eventually dumping a technology on a farmer. And I've mentioned this elsewhere, is that we really think of this 3/3 principle, working with the stakeholders to understand the situation first, then doing the research for 1/3 of the time, and then working with the farmers to get it right in terms of different contexts, different places. So it's the third, for me, innovation is about changing the research system as well, being pretty revolutionary in changing the research system. And it's not simple, because in the research world, the measure of success is the number of publications, and that doesn't get action on the ground. And so one of my roles in the program I lead is fostering a revolution in the research process as well.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And what always strikes me is how fundamental food production is, and still how little we know about it, how it actually works. And if we look a little bit closer in climate change adaptation, we realize sometimes how much wisdom there is in traditional knowledge, and how this can also be feeding back in our research when farmers know what works, but maybe they don't know why it works. And with changing rainfall patterns and changing climatic patterns, how the experience from one area really can be translated into another area. Birgit Gerardo is working with BMZ. Working with smallholders is a long-term priority for German Development Corporation. How is climate change coming into the planning process, and what role is, for example, the new NDC partnership playing in supporting farmers in getting to know their land better and find the right measures to achieve these multiple goals? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let me start with a quote that I think you made in Rome last week when we were together for the NDC partnership on agriculture, and you said it's clear, or it was the Assistant Director General, I don't remember who of you was it, but someone said in the past we always used to say there is no climate change action without forests, and now we are about to say there is no climate change action without agriculture. And I think it's just rightly so that we realize that we have to look much more in the potential of the agricultural sector, and not getting stuck in this old trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation that was very well explained by our Nepalese friend, that we actually, that you can't assess if it's either or, and that you should really focus on what needs to be done under the specific circumstances of agriculture, and giving much more attention to agriculture. To be honest, this is something which we haven't done for years, but we just started to really look more systematically in what we are doing and what we have been doing in the past, and what we should do better in the future. So we are currently in the process of taking stock what we have done so far on where we can step our activities. And it's not so much about adaptation or mitigation, it's really about getting food security and measuring outcome not by greenhouse gas emissions or anything else, but in terms of food security. So dealing with a multiple objective for us is at least clear in the sense that we have an objective which is prior to everything, and that is assuring poverty reduction and food security. For this, my minister launched a special initiative when he assumed duty 4 years ago, which was the special initiative One World, No Hunger. And since then, we stepped up significantly our funds devoted to the agricultural sector and to the food security sector. We are now spending about 1.5 billion euros per year on the whole range of projects. And within this, climate project play a substantial role, but not like specifically labeled climate smart project, but project which do have a climate which do have climate components. I just want to mention briefly 2 or 3 flagship programs, which I think are really interesting in terms of also where we can do more in the future. One is a huge program which we are having on soil rehabilitation in 5 countries, 4 of them in Africa and in India. And the 5th country is India. So, and this is a perfect example how we can really solve this how do you say that in English? Dichotomy between adaptation and mitigation, in the sense that it really helps to improve soil fertility, to get more carbon sequestration in the soil, but also to have better adapted agriculture and to significantly increase food security and income for farmers. And we do have, and this is what I like when Bruce talked about, and you also underlined the knowledge which is there at the farmers level. We do have a very interesting action research component in this program with IFAD, and I visited this in India, and it was fantastic to see a farmer's lady who showed me and it was so visible to have these different fertilizers, organic, mineral fertilizer, mix of mineral, and you could see yield. You could already assess from just looking at the plots how much you would yield from this plot. And they do have then a cooperation with, I think, IFAD in India to get the greenhouse gas emission from these plots. And this is what makes it so visible suddenly for the farmers, so that they understand all of this. And this lady was able to explain everything to me, and she was just one of the farmers in this community. It was amazing to see how it really works if you do bottom-up innovation and then having these close interlinkages with national and agricultural research centers. Second program which I want to mention is a project which is in the process of being developed together with the World Bank and with ILRI in the field of climate smart livestock. Since if we look in there, and which will be in the Horn of Africa, if we look at agriculture there, it is obvious that agriculture is livestock, and that livestock has to do with climate change, and that it needs both adaptation and that it has a huge mitigation potential as well. I had a very interesting discussion before this meeting with Bruce on agricultural insurance, and I promise him here that I will go back home and look more deeply in what needs to be done and what can be done. I think it's a promising future activity. Lastly, we are also funding the ASAP project, ASAP program, and we are funding the program. I stop there because I think I'm not entitled to say more for the time being. We do think that IFAD is a very important player in this field. We also think that FAO is an important player in the NDC partnership, and we got a proof of this last week. Bunch of people, which I see here, some at least, came together in Rome to discuss how we can support implementation of NDCs in the agricultural sector. And I was pretty impressed by the active participation of coming from developing partner countries, which are really keen on knowing, which are really discussing and which were discussing among themselves what can be done and what is best, what needs to be done and what is best to do. So this issue, the whole concept of South-South learning and South-South exchange actually worked pretty well. Germany launched this NDC partnership at the COP in Morocco, and together with Morocco and with many other stakeholders. So I'm not going into all the details, but we do think that it's now time really to also get this down to concrete sectoral activities, and agriculture is the first thematic working group which was founded, and I think it's promising that we start with agriculture there. So for the future, this will be an important activity for us, supporting the implementation of the NDCs at national level, because actually it's our partner countries who determine where they want to see us supporting their activities, and they do have to get plans which we can then support and finance, because it's not our role to formulate such policies, it's their role. We can offer support for this, and we should offer support for financing. And we continue, and I hope we will continue to do so in the future. Or I know that we will, you never know. I am pretty confident that we will continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It reminds me of my little son the day before his birthday, when the box is still wrapped, but by rattling, you know that there's Lego in it. So we might
not too hard with Lego.
So we might be at this point. Bruce, you said dumping information on farmers is not a good solution. Dumping planning on countries also not a good solution. And I share your assessment from the workshop we did under the NDC partnership that the demand of countries is just huge. And our point of departure is currently really the NDCs. And in the NDCs, you see the demand for adaptation in agricultural planning very prominently. The GEF, the Global Environmental Facility, has years experience from that. And I would like to ask your neighbor, Dustin Shin, about the experience that you made. And I understand you've been in the NAP planning world since COP18, so there are some years of experience here. What have you learned about NAP planning? What's the demand of countries? Where do we need to go in?
Well, thank you, Martin. Hi, everyone. I'm aware we're running a little late here, and I'll try to be very brief. So we are in the business of NAP support for about 5 years already. As Martin pointed out, I think we received a request at COP18. But before I go into our support for that, let's just take a step back and see what we actually are and what we do. We have 2 adaptation funds at the GEF, the Least Developed Countries Fund and the Special Climate Change Fund, which together constitute a $1.5 billion program and constitute the longest running publicly funded adaptation program for developing countries. Since COP22 in Marrakesh, we also received additional pledges from the Belgian federal government, the Belgian region of Walloon, Japan and Iceland. So hopefully we can fund some more projects on top of that in the near future. The LDCF in particular, the Least Developed Countries Fund, started off with supporting the formulation of NAPA's, National Adaptation Programs of Action, which basically assess the vulnerability of these LDCs and see what the priorities in those countries for adaptation are. And that is what the LDCF implementation finance has been based upon thereafter. And I think the NAPAs were also helpful for other funds and also bilaterals to really target and tailor the adaptation finance for those LDCs to really meet the needs of the most vulnerable in those countries. So through the LDCF alone, we have funded 249 projects to implement on-the-ground adaptation. And that has a focus on concrete adaptation action and investments on the ground. So this is not necessarily NAP processes or planning policy and so on, but over time, the adaptation projects and the priorities of the countries have evolved from sort of a short-term, immediate priority and thinking on adaptation investments towards a more policy-oriented approach, towards an iterative process in terms of integrating adaptation into national and also subnational local development frameworks. And that, I think, is what the NAP process really what comprises. So that is all sort of one chain of how adaptation has evolved over the last 10 years. So I don't think you can really distinguish too hard between those, but let me get to that back. Let me get back to that later. Africa, I think, since we're talking about food security, Africa is very important. Africa has accessed around 67% of LDCF resources so far, so that's around $800 million just in grant financing. I think that's quite significant, and we have been able to achieve quite significant adaptation in the LDCs with that, but a lot of the projects are also still under implementation, so we will be able to point back to many of the projects in the future. But just to give you an idea, for instance, there's a project in Ethiopia called Promoting Autonomous Adaptation at the Community Level in Ethiopia. And that has already rejuvenated 312 hectares of forest land, protected an additional 800 hectares of forest area from logging, and benefited over 5,000 farmers directly, which sort of has indirect implications for their communities then. I think the most significant achievement is that the wheat production went up by over 300% in the target areas of those investments. So this is very little money in comparison to sort of the achievements that you can have, in particular in the poorest and the most vulnerable countries. This project, I think, was around $6 million US. So it is almost finished, but not yet quite. So let's say in about a year from now, we should be able to look back and say what the final achievements were. But I think a 300% increase in those target areas in terms of wheat production is quite significant. So building off of that, recently this year, we were able to approve a follow-on project which benefited from that pilot experience in Ethiopia. And that project is expected to provide at least 40,000 people with access to improved climate information services. So that in turn also helps the farmers and the food security because these farmers are able to receive tailored text messages, for instance, that provide information on weather forecasts and also provide recommendations as to the precise seeds that could be planted for this particular season. So I think this is really something that that can help also in the medium term. That's then not just a short-term alleviation of sort of the adaptation needs. And the first project has also mainstreamed adaptation considerations into the Green Economy Plan, which is a development framework in Addis. So that's a local development framework, but that's sort of, you know, that sort of provided an example for this country on how to mainstream adaptation into development frameworks. And I think this is very important also for the NAP process. So even though this original project had mainly concrete investments on the ground for farmers, it still had a side benefit for the NAP process. And it kind of got this NAP process going. And I think that is important. And this is also how we have started funding NAP processes. So through the NAPA implementation, through these concrete on-the-ground investments, 76 LDCF projects are already supporting 42 countries in their effort to integrate climate change adaptation into 195 national development policies, plans, and frameworks. And that's not the NAP financing, that's the NAPLA implementation financing. That's sort of just the capacity building that comes with these concrete investments in order for them to sustain maybe the results beyond project completion. And now on top of that, recently we have received pure NAP process formulation or NAP projects, and also mixed NAP and NAPA implementation projects. And these mixed projects usually include a NAP formulation component where the national government is trying to integrate mainstream adaptation into the development frameworks, combined with something that is a concrete investment that's related to that NAP process, and that is usually climate information services in this particular case. So because the climate information, the weather forecast, and all of these issues sort of provide the decision makers with the appropriate information to really make an informed decision on how to integrate adaptation into their development frameworks. Because if the decision maker, and that could be local or national, is not aware of the impacts that are caused by climate change for local communities, for different sectors of the economy, and so on, then it would be very hard to mainstream climate change into these development frameworks. And I think here you can see how that really goes hand in hand with each other. And I think it is important to continue to fund also these concrete investments for adaptation on the ground, and also to build off of the results and the achievements that were made by these projects and by these investments so far, and not to start a parallel process in supporting NAPs sort of disentangled from whatever else in terms of adaptation has been going on in these countries. Now, with that, this current fiscal year, we have approved projects amounting to around $155 million just through the LDCF. That's for different LDCs, not just in Africa, and obviously not just for food security. They target also coastal zone management. They target sometimes infrastructure, ecosystem-based adaptation, and other priority measures. But what we do see is that agriculture remains a priority, the highest priority. In the NAPAs that LDCs developed, I think in 48 of the 50 NAPAs, agriculture is the top priority. And so our LDCF funding has to at least 31% been directed primarily into the agriculture sector. And I think that is something very important also for the NAP process in the future. Now, we have provided around $41 million also for the NAP process directly. That is in particular through 2 global support programs. Initially, we have a global support program for LDCs, and we have one for non-LDCs, all developing countries, of course, that was sort of meant to get the NAP process started in these countries. It is not enough funding to bring it all the way to the end, if there's an end. But I hope and I think that these global support programs were able to provide tailored one-on-one support to many of the LDCs also. All the LDCs are eligible, and to start raising adaptation on the national development agenda and to start the thinking on the NAP process. So I think that will help these countries also further delve into the individual planning frameworks in the future. So with that, I would stop here, and then I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for this rich presentation and the broad range of experiences, really connecting the planning with action on the ground, which is, I would dare say, in agriculture more difficult than anywhere else, just because of the sheer number of stakeholders. And also of the interplay of adaptation planning, NAPAs, NAPs, and the concrete action on the ground. Now, the GCF is in this area a relatively new player. We are eager to learn from you, Juan, how actually the GCF is supporting NAPS planning, the broader adaptation planning. How do you see the context, and how could you pick up what Dustin just said about the plea of not having NAPS just isolated, but embedded in the broader range of experiences made? Juan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I may to start, just to thank IFAD and FAO for organizing this event. They're 2 key partners for the fund. So we appreciate you taking the leadership on this. And most certainly, I do want to recognize the efforts made by our colleagues from Nepal in spearheading this work in breaking ground, frankly, on the work related to NAPSA, the GCF. So we know it's been probably a little more painful for them than they originally anticipated, and we certainly recognize that. So we hope to hear even more positive stories on the implementation of that NAP very soon. So most certainly we are kind of, not only because I'm speaking at the end, but kind of realizing all these different experiences that have happened. I hear that we're not to dump data, we're not to dump planning, we're not to just sort of dump the project for the sake of it, but rather needs to be well placed. And this is certainly why the support that the GCF is providing for adaptation planning, it's actually in a broader context than just a standalone isolated fund, but it's actually well placed within a readiness program that is intended not just to have an outcome for an outcome, but an outcome that will enable countries to engage with us, to engage with the fund, to engage with larger financiers, to be able to maximize the opportunities that are part of the larger climate finance landscape. That includes our colleagues from the GEFs, that includes the Adaptation Fund, and some of the other channels that are there. And so it is in that sense that, as being part of the readiness program, there are several opportunities so that it needs to be thought through so that it actually has as an outcome more than just a document, more than just something that will sit in the shelf of a ministry and begin to collect dust. That is the support. That is the vision for the support we are making available. That means we have made the support, and to put the number clear out there, we're making support available up to $3 million per country for pursuing national adaptation plans and other adaptation planning processes. But I think that it's much more important than just putting this number out there. It's actually the importance of realizing that the outcomes that we want to achieve from this investment are quite they need to be quite specific to country circumstances, and why we need to think through this very carefully. The resources we're making available, we hope will achieve outcomes as they relate to governance and coordination that will, for example, allow for a stakeholder engagement process that is designed to ensure that stakeholders, that is farmers, that is associations, civil society, academia, and others, actually have a space to constantly come together and think through more than just writing this on a document, but what does a dynamic and iterative process of adaptation look like? We are hoping to see as an outcome of the investment that we're making available a supporting and assessment framework that will allow for identifying and appraising options that countries can finance. We're hoping for, as an outcome of the support made available, to see system and coordination of systems for gathering and organizing and updating relevant data for planning and for implementation of adaptation action. We also hope to see concrete financing plans that will prioritize adaptation actions so that they can be and that includes for the mobilization of domestic, international, private resources that can sort of put adaptation in more than just the context of a few activities that are identified at the end of it all. I think that most importantly, what we need to put in context is that through the resources that the GCF is making available, what we hope to see are the type of initiatives that result in larger investment, that result in larger action, in the type of action that, say, to put it in the context of small farmers, investments like the ones that the fund decided to make in Sri Lanka, that are there to strengthen the resilience of smallholder farmers to climate variability and to integrate and to support integrated approaches to water management. And so this, then let me loop it back to conclude to NDCs. And the answer is that, and when asked about what's the linkage of NDCs to NAPs and this, quite frankly, everything that I just said, we applied just basically the same words applied to NDCs. What we hope to see and the resources that we can make available for countries in formulating their NDCs, while we don't have a cap that is as high as 3 million for that, we hope to see that as part of an iterative process, countries can begin to translate these priorities that they have identified in their NDCs into concrete program, what we call country programs, that countries are developing with us that hope to see this action be brought for financing to the fund. And so I think I leave it at that. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Juan. And putting that in the perspective of an investment framework, I think the big topic now really is how do we turn the political commitment into concrete action? And I've seen, going to several board meetings of the Green Climate Fund, how the thinking became more and more upstream and how more and more money is available to actually create the basic conditions that then can lead to larger investment projects. Many thanks for that. Well, thanks to the panelists' discipline, we have enough time for questions, for comments, and we got a pretty remarkable device here, which is a soft box that I can throw around with a microphone inside. Without Legos. I can throw it in your direction. I have to warn you, I'm a terribly awful thrower and an even worse catcher, but you can use that, and if you're not happy with interventions, you can throw it back quite strongly. So I'm trying to get this to you for your first question.
Almost there.
And if you could just briefly identify yourself.
So I'm Bertrand Noiret from Action Against Hunger, a French NGO working to fight against malnutrition. So I want to thank you for the panel. Thank you especially for Ms. Gerardus for saying that you put food security and ending poverty at the heart of your projects before reducing greenhouse gas emissions. On this panel, I was quite expecting to see farmers, because when we are saying about making win-win solution for farmers, I'm always wondering, how are they consulted? Are their expectation taken into account? So I'm going to ask Mr. Lamsal, how were they integrated in the definition of Nepal's SNAP, and maybe how the GEF and the GCF are going to make sure that they are consulted while designing NAPs and NDCs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bertrand. You missed the event yesterday evening where we had very strong farmers representation. But who wants to go next? If you can just throw the box 2 lines. Yeah, there you go. Please.
Thank you. Elisha Moy is my name. I'm the Minister of Environment, Water and Climate in Zimbabwe. I've been involved in the development of the adaptation in Zimbabwe, especially the NDC in Zimbabwe, especially the adaptation component. I have a question with regard to adaptation costing. Whether from the panelists, do we have sort of close to mature technologies to have adaptation costing, which could then be used even for further revision of the NDCs? We realized that we had quite some good tools and in the mitigation side, but for adaptation, they were quite varied, top-down, bottom-up, and if we talk about top-down, it needs a lot of climate models, which are often not as used in developing countries. So do we have those? And if we don't, do we have no regret options to say we accept we don't know how the climate will change in the future, but to be resilient in whatever direction, to have those low regret option. To the GCF colleague, I have a question with regard to long-term finance for agriculture. I understand agriculture is a sensitive, should I say, area in most countries where there's at times high-level interventions and prices can fluctuate quite a lot. Do we have ways of ensuring that we have good agricultural projects which make business sense to be submitted to the GCF? How can we get those? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to your neighbor here on that side. It's unfair. That's so much more an easier shot.
That's much easier. See how much better thrower he is. I'm Jeff Skier from the International Renewable Energy Agency. Yesterday, I skipped out of here to go to an event with a lot of farmers across the street at one of the German research institutes, where they were discussing the challenges in raising the yields. And one of the challenges apparently is that the extension services have almost disappeared due to lack of funding and corruption, and it was suggested that perhaps a way to get farmers to raise yields could be to work through the outgrowers associations and perhaps use the senior farmers as a vehicle to getting the techniques to the smaller farmers. So I wanted to ask your views on that, but also to respond to Justin Sin's very interesting case study in Ethiopia. I'm wondering if this or other case studies are considering farmers growing wood crops in addition to food crops because the kind of agroforestry approach with the nitrogen fixing wood crops can actually be a bonus by doubling or tripling the yield of the food crops. So not meant to be a speech, but just to get some reaction.
Thank you very much. Behind you, 4 lanes. Let's see what you get. Okay.
Thank you. My question is for the Dustin with the Green Climate Fund as well, and it's a bit more specific around when you're talking about the technology implication. Sorry, it's been a long week. Because we've been hearing a little bit about this in different sessions about using this mobile technology in these rural type settings and things like that. And I'm just thinking about, no one's really explained the long-term perhaps sustainability of those kind of projects, and wondering whether like, is their finance continue these? Like, is there backup support that's going to continue? Are these farmers having to pay for the service, or is it completely free? Those types of questions. Thank you.
Maybe with that, we go into a first round of answers. Keep the cube in the audience for the next round of questions. So where are the farmers in your deliberations? One question about the costing of adaptation. And if I may, I also read two things into that. One is the question that's always there with climate finance, the question of additionality. How do you deal with something that has so many benefits when you look at funding from a specific angle? And also the question, I think that was a very good one from Zimbabwe about the fact, which I haven't heard actually in this week, that adapting in agriculture climate change is not a one-off. The climate continues to change, and so we also need a dynamic adaptation process that for the first 5 years might be something else than for the next 5 years. So how do you put this dynamic in? And then the question about agroforestry, wood crops, energy production, bioenergy as part of A, income generation, and B, nitrogen fixing for soils. That, I think, has your name on it, Bruce. And the question about mobile technology as a solution and the sustainability of it. How do you get that on the long term to farmers? Who wants to go first from my panel in responding? Bruce, should we start with the agroforestry? I know it's your pet topic.
So once again, I think it's really context specific, and there's some really great examples where agroforestry is fantastic, but in other circumstances, it's not going to be great. So it's definitely an option, but of course, it depends on the farmers, the situation, the biophysics of the surrounds. So just to say yes, it's definitely on the cards. Perhaps I could just quickly do the extension one as well, because it was also from yourself. And once again, I think it's highly context specific. So in Mali, working through the farmers' organizations, which have got a fantastic structure right down to the ground level, is a great option. Work in Senegal, we're working with community radio stations that then link into local innovation platforms led by farmers as well. So I think it also depends on countries, but I think one of the crucial needs is dealing with the extension problem, how you get information through to farmers so they can adapt continuously.
Thanks very much. Please, Birgit, go ahead.
Yeah. I would just like to add two short sentences on this question of agroforestry. I mean, as Bruce said, of course, it's context specific, but I think it points to this important dimension of not looking into agriculture or forests, what we tend to do a bit, but looking really at the landscape dimension, no? Because it's we had this discussion over dinner. It might even be good, even if you increase from 10 kilo nitrogen per hectare to 50, it might be bad for greenhouse gas emissions if you go up, but then it reduces the pressure on the forests and you can keep the forest. So it's a complex system, and it only works if you look at it from a landscape or a territorial perspective. So I think it makes a lot of sense to look much more integrated into this question of forests and agriculture in agroforestry system, but also in landscape approaches, which for me personally, it's always, we say it, but we know very little on what we do with it concretely and in our operations. No? I mean, everybody would agree, yes, landscapes are an important factor, but then if it comes to concrete, and what does it mean now for my project design in A, B, or C, it's still difficult to handle it and to have this integrating, because it's not only Ministry of Environment and Agriculture, then it's Ministry with Forests. And we had this discussion a lot on what you can do for forests in Zambia, and it shows really this whole pressure on wood energy. I think wood energy is one of the very, very important future topics which we should look into much more deeply. And actually, everything comes together: food security, forest, sustainability, climate, poverty, income generation, and so on. So it's one of the topics which in my division we said we will focus much more attention on in the next year. I hope we can and we will manage, but I think it's an important issue, as was this very important remark on how to deal with dynamics in climate change. And I think we still are in the process of identifying answers, and we will continue to do so while we are implementing. This is why it's so important to have these feedback loops and always have the stakeholder and back and forth linkages in policy formulation, because we actually don't know, or we know too little to have the right answer right now.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear that wood energy is coming up, because for two reasons. One is that if we speak about bioenergy, very often the immediate reflex is we are speaking about biodiesel and production for energy purposes. But the sheer fact that you basically have 2 billion people on this planet who are depending from biomass as their primary source of energy, and as you said, that this is intrinsically interrelated to so many things. And let me add health also to the list of things that you mentioned with wood energy is really interesting. And it also question of legal frameworks. We have examples where producing of charcoal was outlawed, but then it's happening anyway, but it's happening illegally and even more inefficient than it could be, increasing actually the pressure on forests instead of sustainably managing that. But we haven't heard now for the question about digital technology and how to make it sustainable. And Dustin, if I can give this question to you, since you shared the case study from Ethiopia.
Thank you. Yeah, these were actually some quite provocative questions, and I'm very pleased to discuss them here. In terms of the sustainability beyond project completion, I think the answer is it depends, because it depends on the country, on the national ownership, on the quality of the project. But so far, our experience has been that in most cases, the results are actually sustained beyond project completion because of the capacity building components that accompany these concrete investments. So when there is investment in a weather monitoring station and let's say the cell phone technology, then that's not standalone. That comes with a capacity building component that targets both the government as well as extension officers and farmers directly. So the people in the government would then have the capacity to sustain these weather monitoring stations, to know how they work exactly, what to do with them, how to process the information, and how to pass it on to farmers. And the farmers get basically targeted, very tailored information that is so easy to understand that really no training is needed. But they do get the training in terms of from the extension officers in terms of what the options are. I went to a project in Zambia that worked with extension officers, and there I think I was able to see that a limited amount of investment is needed to train these extension officers and for them to go out and sort of replicate and sustain these project results. So I think this is a good question, and I'm sure that there may be some examples where that hasn't worked, but in most cases, that's absolutely not the case. This is something where people really see the immediate benefits, and that's why they want to sustain it. I mean, if in Ethiopia you have 300% increase in the wheat production for the same area for one farmer, then that farmer will be very interested in maintaining that, even if you leave. And just to add on that, because the CHEF is financial mechanism not just for the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, but also for other conventions, biodiversity, for instance, and the UNCCD, we do more and more also focus on integrated approaches that sort of look, for instance, on agroforestry or have climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation benefits as well. And we have had an integrated approach pilot in CHEF 6 for food security in sub-Saharan Africa that starts delivering at the moment very concrete results. And based on this, we are proposing for GEF7 to have a impact program also on food security. So this is something that, of course, will take into account other areas and in particular agroforestry and things like that. In South Sudan also, we approved the very first adaptation project through the LDCF recently for about $10 million that works in conflict-affected areas. And there you can also see that I think agroforestry, conservation agriculture, smart agriculture sort of go hand in hand with trying to alleviate the push factors for migration. And that is something that can have benefits not just for adaptation, but also for mitigation and against land degradation, for instance, for other conventions as well. And I think that's what countries wanted to do when they decided on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I hope that answers parts of the question. There are some more, but I want to leave something for my neighbors as well. So.
Cool. One question is related to me, particularly in country like ours. If we want to address environmental problem, climate change, disasters risk, or adaptation, they are too costly. That is next to impossible if they are trying to, if we try to address them in isolated. So here the challenge is there are three keywords that they are used frequently. One is mainstreaming, the second one is integration, third one is harmonizing. So you can just judge which word is appropriate. They have to be mainstream or integrated or harmonized with the development process. So in that case, I think two policy document that will be the super policy document in country like ours. One is NAP. The second one is NDC. They will not be only the document of Ministry of Environment. So that will be the document of the government or government of Nepal's document. So to make it mandatory, to make it morally or institutionally binding, so we were in process to develop legal tool, institutional tool, and process tool. But suddenly we have been constrained by two factors, that we are in state restructuring in which the local level election is ongoing. So that is one factor. The second, we are also in process of this recovery and reconstruction from the problem of earthquake. So the priorities of the government is in these two areas. Of course, the climate change has recently been recognized as one of the major problems. That is the case. So the NAP and this NDCs, they are prepared with the intention to implement, not with the intention for academic reference. So there is a challenge in future. So how can we pursue and how can we educate and how can sensitize the sector ministry, particularly to take these issues of climate change in their sectoral development and social welfare process and security, national security process. That is the challenge for us. So I will just take the case of particularly the role of agriculture sector in particularly in climate change. Country like ours, I pronounce both adaptation and mitigation. There has been two elements. That is, one is missing link. The second one is lack of recognition. Just I will give the example of agroforestry and community-based forest management, in which Nepal is renowned. But hold the backbone and hold the foundation is the agriculture sector, because when the intervention are there, but just to take the case of community-based forest management or community forestry, from UNFCCC to the national policy process, it is classified as mitigation. It is not, because these local community forestry user groups, they are farmers. They are relying on agriculture crops and livestock to improve their livelihood, to adapt, to mitigate. So, of course, there is a need to establish this link and to get recognition of agriculture sector in terms of its contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Amina Mohammed is currently in Bonn, and there was a town hall meeting going on. And she will address the delegates tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And one of the things she said, since Bonn hosts 2 of the 3 Rio conventions and 1 scientific advisory body, saying that the Rio conventions are not there to work in silos, but they should deliver together. And I think if she were in the audience, she would be quite happy to see how we constantly work on the interlinkages also with the disaster risk reduction framework. Juan, I don't know whether you want to come in because there are more questions. Do you want to come in now or maybe in the second round? What would you prefer? Please, then go ahead with the questions and then we come to you and then second round for questions.
Sure. Okay, so in that case, I will be brief to the 4 questions. Sorry, no, 3 questions I spotted, and it's first with regards to inclusion and with regards to process of consultation. Well, first, that is actually one of when I refer to wanting to see as an outcome of the investment that the fund is prepared to make on NAPS. To be governance and coordination, that's precisely the type of outcome that we're referring to, having a consultation process in place that enables for the engagement of all relevant stakeholders. And so in that sense, we're referring wanting to see that the institutional arrangements to support adaptation planning processes are in place. And we can't think of one without sort of strong consultation process. Why do we want to see that in place? Frankly, because at the next step of the modalities of the engagement with GCF, we certainly want to make sure that if the fund has takes environmental social safeguards very seriously. We want to make sure that when countries come forward to bring forward $100 million project for implementation on agriculture-related activities, that it will actually have in place through this investment that we'll be making on NAPS to the necessary processes, so that it can, regardless of the risk category that the project might fall in, be able to carry out these consultation processes that are a requirement for this type of investment. So one sort of fits into the other. With regards to methodologies for adaptation costing and no regrets, that again, we certainly don't have a standalone single methodology that we applied to all operations of the fund. That what we find is that more often than not, this type of methodologies tend to be very country specific, very context specific. We are, however, prepared to see countries make that part of the investment that they need for adaptation planning, and that we can imagine having this type of methodologies being developed under the type of outcomes that are achieved for NAPS as being a pretty significant result of these resources being made available. So we really hope to see that type of thinking of moving from just general costing to identification of no regret measures, etc., be something that countries take very seriously. On the question of long-term finance and ensuring the good quality of projects, well, that actually looks back precisely to why we're here today. The very fact that we want to see this type of the only way for us to expect this type of strong projects to be in the pipeline, it's actually if we invest in this type of strong thinking upstream that we hope to see as an outcome of NAPS. And so that is very much in line with one of the key things that the fund's trying to do. Interestingly enough, and without going into too much of a tangent, while a portfolio, it's still in a stage that we don't have the 20 years of experience that our sister fund has in financing. We're certainly beginning to see a clear trend, for example, in the needs that countries are putting forward when it comes to climate services, and when it comes to sort of wanting to have some of these things that really are what will enable that you can have sort of stronger projects on agriculture, on general sort of water management, etc. And so this is an interesting, I will call it personal reflection for now.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, our microphone cube continued to go around, and I think there's a lady in the back who wants to ask a question. We can take 2-3 short questions, and then I would ask the panelists to answer and also have already your 2-minute closing remarks ready. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Lucy Nganga from Kenya. I think mine is more of a remark. It does not necessarily require a response, because this issue of technology is coming again. Remember, we had it coming up in our, I think, Wednesday discussion. And I think the concerns are there of sustainability, because we have many developing countries with very small here and there pilot projects on technologies, especially using a mobile phone. And there was also the concern of connectivity, that, it's not always there. But I think, the gentleman from GCF and the speaker from the expert for the NAP, I think the issue here to consider is going forward as the project proposals are developed and are intended to be supported. I think it's important also to factor in how maybe the projects also assist the governments in putting up the infrastructure, and then even how to rope in the private sector, because without government having to, the infrastructure is not a small thing. It's something that requires to be, developed and maintained, and projects can only do so much. So I think that capacity, even as we build capacity for the extension workers, the farmers, the approach must be a bit more widened in terms of infrastructure, in terms of even the extension workers, as you say. And that will maybe in a way also create a scenario where if it makes business sense, then the private sector will not need to be lured into it. But when we have projects that come, do some pilot, very successful, documents come up, and then it's done deal, then it goes. Then they say, okay, we are waiting for another project to come and do either similar or something different. If they were doing with the maize, they can do with the cattle. So maybe it's good to ponder that. How do you rope in other major players who can actually help in the sustainability of the projects? More so government infrastructure, private sector, because like mobile networks and stuff are actually owned by private entities in most developing countries. I don't know about this side of the world. Yeah, that's my contribution to that. Because technology is anyway becoming a way of life, even at the very, very marginalized poor communities. You still find, even though their technology take up may be low, but it's taking up. So we can't ignore, because that looks like the way to go. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Any more questions? Last chance here. Yes, the gentleman here in the 3rd row.
Do I need to throw?
Yes, you get a drum roll. Perfect.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Mokwena France, and I come from Lesotho. I have 2 questions. One goes to Nepal. We are now in the process of developing NAP proposal for NAP formulation proposal to GCF. So having learned that you went through the same process and then you were successful, I just want to learn, how did you go about it? What advice can you give us that we can use to make our proposal successful? The other one goes to the funding agencies, maybe GCF and the JEF. To what extent do you support data collection and research, that building the data collection systems and research? In our countries, we have a challenge of data and research to support our proposal development, because we have to justify to show there's a problem that you are trying to address. So it's difficult to come up with proposals without a sound data collection and research. In agriculture, you'll find that where we have fields where we are doing agriculture, it's not everywhere we have climate stations. So we cannot actually assess how much impact the climate is having on agriculture. So that means we can't even say in the future, this is how much the climate will affect the agriculture. So that's the importance of maybe having data in doing the planning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have space for one last question. If not, okay. If not, I would give the first word to Nepal, the experience of Nepal. You were asked directly from Lesotho about how can you learn from this experience, and then I would also like to come back on your question on data collection. But please go ahead and also take
thank
the
you very
liberty
much.
to have your
So,
2 minutes of wrapping up.
In the last week, LDC group had also asked me to make a presentation on how Nepal could succeed in to access the GCF fund for NAP process. So in our case, it was exactly 60 days. It took 60 days when we sent document to UNEP to submit to GCF. Then we got confirmation at Marrakesh that the proposal has been approved. So in the time frame was 60 days. So no one is going to believe that it was too short time that we got confirmed about the support in receiving in preparation of NAP. So the presentation is with me. I can share with you immediately, but what just in short, I want to say that make a checklist, what need to be done, then follow consistently, make a checklist. And it depends on much on who will be there on behalf of multilateral entities, the accredited entity, who is going to support you. It depends on that. Once your NDA provides the letter, then the responsibility is much more on that particular entity to support you. So it depends on their action and their initiative a lot in order to achieve the support. And in my understanding, if it is correct, if it is for NAP formulation process, the process in GCF is not long. It is very slim process. It is shortcut process. So I can provide you my presentation. My suggestion would be make a 1 or 2 page checklist and consistently follow it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now, this is a very concrete outcome. If you share your checklist, we are directly where we want to be. Absolutely. I want to give the floor now to the 2 gentlemen from GCF and from Jeff, and I want to take the question on data collection as a point of departure for that. Because what we see is, what you just said is so common for every single country that's trying to do adaptation work, that the database is not there, it's shaky, it's maybe not accessible. So the need for data collection and data dissemination in an understandable way, and Dustin, you made this point very clearly, that it needs to be translated into something that farmers can actually use. This is something that actually requires, I would say, programmatic approaches, continental approaches, if not global approaches. So how does that fit in the in a financing landscape? Are there, and I know that, for example, the GCF is all about country drivenness and country initiative, but how can, out of this prerogative of country drivenness, a program emerge that is actually looking at the fundamental needs of an entire continent or subcontinent? I would like to start with Juan, maybe with this question on the financing, and also combine it with what you asked about how do you tie in other communities, how do you get the private sector in, and then the question is also going to the Jeff as well, and to hear the nuances. But Juan, please.
Thank you. And I think what I will do is to take you up on the 2 minutes reflection. I think I will add to the checklist that our colleague from Nepal just spoke to. So first on the question of the private sector, at the GCF, we find that this specific issue of the involvement of the private sector is one that for us is more than just wanting to sort of like see them in the room. We want to see the private sector engage in the operations, in the work of countries, also in a very prominent role. And that's why we have set up a specific facility that deals with the private sector angle and try to launch very specific initiatives, such as a request for proposals that it's still standing on the small and medium enterprises in developing countries that with an emphasis actually on seeds and LDCs as well. That was created precisely to try to trigger more involvement. But even with this, I'm the first one to recognize that this hasn't been enough, and that much more thinking is required precisely to address the type of comments that our colleague from Kenya, if I recall correctly, said. For this, we realized that things like, for example, a proper feasibility study that can actually ensure that when we talk about involvement, the private sector is more than just an aspiration, but that we're talking about actual bankable projects. It's something that the fund is prepared to finance as an additional component and in preparation through something that we call the project preparation facility. So I think I'll leave my comments there, but in complete agreement with our colleague. On the question of data collection and research, there's actually several different ways to look at this. Yes, I mean, first is the question of why are we collecting data? What is it for? Because the second that you begin to build on that on that question, you realize that actually, yes, you can actually do this with a GCF. It just needs to be put in perhaps in a much larger context that connects to our result areas. At this moment, we certainly don't have any sort of standalone research and observation project just without being connected to anything else that is a country need. We have projects that certainly have a sort of pilot research component to certain things, but not at the continental level to answer that question. That said, the fund at this moment, and sorry, not at this moment, but in a few months, will be specifically taking up on the question of collaborative research and development, which I believe that might yield some space for having more nuanced conversations around some of these issues. So we certainly, I think it's part of a larger conversation that the fund is certainly prepared to have. And so that leads me to my last remarks, and I want to very much connect to the comments made by our colleague from Nepal earlier. First and foremost, I think that the experience of Nepal, it needs to be put in the context of all the work that have been done in Nepal before. It's a country that had invested a lot in sort of, for example, the LAPAs that you have, and this concept that the NAPAs that they had implemented, and all this previous work that actually had added up to something, and they picked up from that, and so they didn't start from scratch. They built on those initiatives that they had financed through other parts of the financial mechanism, through bilateral donors, and to try to put them in context. So I think with that, there are two recommendations that I from where I sit will suggest in considering this. First, it's built in what you already have, even if it's something as simple as your NatCom. Work that you have already financed in understanding your vulnerability. Don't try to reflect on it. Try to sort of utilize these things so that all this work that has happened before, it was done for a reason, and you can leapfrog from what was already done there. The second is that it's that as you're formulating your options for adaptation planning, that as every action that you're identifying, I think you need to ask yourself the question: how is this going to help me later? How are these steps that I'm building in my NAP going to be putting me in a better position so that I can be better able to access larger resources, that I can be able to incentivize concrete action, so that again, I think these two very simple recommendations might help you be in a better position. Hopefully we'll have many more stories than the one from Nepal.
Thank you very much. Dustin, your 2 minutes of reflection and wrapping up.
Thank you. Well, that is hard to follow. That was a good response to, I think, the questions that were posed. So let me just pick on a private sector question. What do you mean with private sector? What is it really that you're referring to when you talk about private sector and adaptation? Because that can mean a lot of different things. We do have private sector engagement and adaptation to a degree, to a healthy degree, but it is far less than, let's say, in mitigation. And that is for a very simple reason, because often the adaptation needs are really just relating to the livelihoods of the poorest and the most vulnerable people. And private sector for these people can mean a farmers association, maybe. It can be a seed bank and a farmers association that sort of allows them to persist through prolonged droughts or flooding periods, and that may create access to the market, maybe the national or maybe the regional market, where there was no access before, and that can be private sector engagement and adaptation. I think we've seen a lot of that, most certainly in the least developed countries. For the climate information services, there is increasingly also interest from the private sector in the LDCs in developing countries overall to have up-to-date climate information, and they are willing to pay for it. We see that now in some countries where, for instance, airports that before did not have access to weather information, to accurate weather information in the area that the airport is located, these private sector organizations are interested in paying for these services. But if you compare it to developed countries, those services are often provided by the public sector. It's not necessarily something that has to be private. So it is hard to distinguish here, and I think it's important to look at what you're really trying to achieve. What is it that you're trying to achieve? You're trying to help these people adapt and cope with the impacts of climate change, and private sector is a tool for that. It's a means, but it's not the goal. And this is how we're working in particular in the LDCs. So we do have a dedicated private sector instrument. We have a non-grant pilot, for instance. We had, I think, $110 million for equity investments, concessional lending and guarantees in CHEF 6. And we've done that even in the replenishment before. We're planning to do something similar in the next replenishment, but that is mostly not targeting adaptation specifically for the reasons I just highlighted. So I think these tools can be very helpful, in particular for other areas such as renewable energy, energy efficiency, and so on, where you really can create a reflow. You have a financial reflow that can repay, for instance, concessional loans. But in adaptation, I don't really see that being demanded too often. With that, I think the question, public versus private, also leads back to the original question of this session here, which is how the NDCs and also the NAPs sort of link together. And I think here you can see a successful NAP project would actually lead to the government recognizing, a certain adaptation action as a priority, and maybe allocating a budget line to it in the National Development Framework, or somehow accounting for that in the development of the economy going forward. And that's sort of a means to achieving what the national government pledged as part of the national contribution under the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contribution, the NDC. So I think the NAP really is a process to achieving what is in the NDC, and that links back also to the data collection research question, because what needs to be absolutely accurate and based on good information data is the NDC in the first place. I think it's the national pledge and the assessment of sort of what the country is willing to do in terms of adaptation, or where it sees the adaptation going forward. And that should be part of the NDC. I think we've seen that in most of the countries in the developing world happening, and the NAP process should probably be a means of achieving that on the ground. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dustin, and really delivering on the key question of this evening. Thank you very much for that. Birgit, your 2 minutes of final reflection.
I think I'll limit to 1.5 since I'm standing between us and the beer. No, and it has been such a rich discussion that it is hard to focus on one aspect. But I was really inspired by seeing this sudden South-South exchange popping up, and which leads me to the conclusion that I think it's a good idea if we want to continue to support developing countries in implementing their NDCs. A very good way to do so is offering a platform for such South-South exchange. And I think I'm looking forward to continue to discuss this further under the heading of the NDC partnership.
Thank you very much.
50
indeed.
seconds, probably.
Fantastic. Bruce, can you do the same?
I will do even less. So I think that we really want to shift from the INDC documents, the NAP documents, to action on the ground. And I think my two messages would be, first one, the one is to me. Let's really change the research system to an innovation system that works for society change, helping society change. And the second one, and I wrote this down before everybody else said it, was let's foster more South-South learning. I think that's really important, and it's great that it came out from the audience. We found some real great successes with South-South learning between Latin America and Africa, for example, and really unexpected successes as well. So let's foster more South-South.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the discipline of our presenters, I have now enough time to give you a PowerPoint presentation on FAO's work. No, I'm not. What I want to say is this was the second event in a 3-event series co-organized by the Rome-based agencies, IFAD, World Food Programme, and FAO. And the third and last event is going to be next Tuesday, 16th May, 13:15 to 40:45 in the Bonn room, and the topic will be achieving the Paris Agreement through climate action in the land sector. And we will also look into, is that an area where additional ambition can be coming from? Information that was mentioned this evening is available online, and with that I don't want to hold you any longer. Just join me in a big round of applause for our fantastic presenters, and thank you for a great evening.
If you want to remind us for
Thank you.